At 2 in the morning, a private security detail bypassed the main gates of Kensington Palace, carrying an executive order signed by Prince William himself. For 30 years, this underground vault remained untouched, sealed by a legal firewall meant to protect the royal family's darkest secrets. But as the iron doors groaned open, an encrypted alert lit up King Charles's phone at Highgrove House, triggering an immediate panic. William wasn't just exploring, he was looking for a specific black-bound diary that his mother hid days before her death. What he pulled from the dust would completely alter his relationship with the king, leaving Charles entirely speechless. A mother's final command. The legal paperwork that started it all sat in a faded manila folder inside the Duchy of Cornwall archive office. Prince William found it by accident during a routine audit of estate properties. It was a standard afternoon in early 2024. He was reviewing old land deeds when his fingers brushed against a thick, wax-sealed envelope. The exterior bore the personal crest of Princess Diana and a date stamped just weeks before her fatal crash in 1997. The envelope contained a 3-page directive written in her hurried, slanted handwriting. It explicitly barred any member of the royal household from entering her private storage basement without the express written consent of both her sons. For over 2 decades, the institution respected that boundary, leaving the subterranean room beneath Kensington Palace entirely dark. But the letter did more than just set a boundary. It contained a specific chilling warning about a collection of personal papers regarding the future succession. William read the pages twice under the sharp desk light of his study. His mother had written about a contingency plan, a set of documents that would protect her children if the monarchy ever faced a crisis of legitimacy. She referenced an agreement made during her divorce proceedings that the public never saw. This wasn't about jewelry or dresses. This was about a hidden lever of political power. The Prince of Wales called his private secretary into the room immediately. He didn't ask for advice. He gave a direct order to prepare the paperwork for an official entry warrant. The legal machinery of the palace usually moves at a crawl. Decisions like this require committee meetings, security reviews, and explicit approval from the reigning monarch. William bypassed the entire network. He used his unique legal authority as the head of the estate to authorize the search. Meanwhile, a quiet panic began to ripple through the lower levels of the palace staff. A trusted archivist named Michael Sanderson, who had served the family since the late 80s, noticed the sudden movement of security personnel. He saw the heavy master keys being pulled from the central safe in the basement of Buckingham Palace. Sanderson knew exactly what those keys opened. He made a single brief phone call to a private line in Gloucestershire. At Highgrove House, the phone rang in the king's private study. King Charles was working through his evening red boxes when the message arrived. His face went pale as his advisor explained the situation. William was moving toward the vault, and he was doing it without asking for permission. The king demanded his car be readied, but his staff advised against a sudden late-night trip to London. It would look like an admission of guilt to anyone watching. Instead, Charles ordered an immediate digital intercept. He wanted to know exactly which files his son was targeting. For years, the king believed these specific papers had been destroyed by a loyal courtier shortly after the funeral in 1998. The realization that they were still intact, sitting under a layer of dust in central London, changed everything. The balance of power between father and son was about to snap. William arrived at the Kensington courtyard accompanied by only 2 trusted protection officers. The night air was freezing, and the palace grounds were completely silent. They walked past the shuttered windows of the state apartments, heading toward a narrow, unmarked door beneath the West Lane staircase. The officers used a heavy iron key to break the initial security seal, forcing open a door that hadn't moved in decades. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and damp concrete. A single row of fluorescent lights flickered to life, casting long shadows across rows of steel shelving. This was the outer holding area, filled with ordinary corporate records from the 90s. But William wasn't looking at the shelves. He walked directly toward a heavy, dark green safe bolted into the back wall. The safe required a combination that Diana had left coded within her final letter. William knelt on the cold floor, his fingers turning the brass dial. On the 3rd turn, the mechanism clicked, but the heavy door wouldn't budge. A secondary lock had been installed, a modern digital keypad that required a master code William didn't possess. Someone had altered the security system without updating the official archive logs. The prince stood up, his face tight with anger. He realized someone within the palace apparatus had actively tried to lock him out. He ordered his security team to bring down a hydraulic breaching tool from their vehicle. There would be no waiting for an official locksmith. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the underground corridors, shattering the quiet of the palace night. Within 4 minutes, the modern lock cracked open, revealing the deep interior of the safe. William reached inside, expecting to find the black-bound diary his mother mentioned. Instead, his hand closed around a completely empty leather folio. The primary document was gone. The only thing left inside the compartment was a small silver key and a single handwritten note left by an unknown staff member. The note contained a single sentence, written in faded blue ink. It directed the reader to look behind the main electrical breaker panel on the north side of the room. William didn't hesitate. He walked across the damp concrete floor, his boots making a dull thudding sound in the silence. He found the metal utility box, pulled it away from the brick wall, and discovered a secondary, recessed cavity. Inside this hidden wall compartment sat a second folder, bound in heavy canvas. This was the true repository. William pulled it out and opened the cover. The first page was a confidential memo dated 1996, detailing a secret financial settlement meant to be triggered only if the throne bypassed the traditional line of inheritance. As William turned the pages, he realized the scope of what his mother had prepared. She had documented every internal conversation regarding the Regency Acts of the late 20th century. She knew the pressures her sons would face. She had gathered signed statements from legal advisors, constitutional experts, and former members of the Privy Council. These weren't mere reflections, they were actionable legal weapons. The phone in William's pocket vibrated violently. The caller ID showed the encrypted line for Highgrove House. He let it ring out, refusing to interrupt his reading. He needed to understand the full weight of the evidence before he faced his father. Every paragraph revealed a new layer of institutional maneuvering designed to keep these exact truths from ever reaching the public eye. William instructed his team to pack the files into secure transport bags. They locked the basement door behind them, leaving the broken digital keypad on the floor as evidence of their entry. The drive back to his private residence was completely silent. The prince sat in the back seat, staring at the canvas folder on his lap, knowing that by morning, the entire dynamic of the royal household would be permanently altered. Back in Gloucestershire, Charles paced his study until dawn. His senior advisors sat on a video link, trying to assess the legal vulnerability of the crown. The documents Diana secured weren't just personal journals, they were constitutional landmines. If William chose to act on them, the established protocols of the transition of power would be called into question, forcing a confrontation that the palace was entirely unprepared to handle. Dust and disruption at Kensington Palace. The black leather briefcase clicked open on the passenger seat of William's unmarked vehicle. He didn't wait for his driver to open the door when they pulled back up to the side entrance of Kensington Palace Apartments. The air inside the main hallway still smelled of floor wax and centuries of damp stone. It was 5 a.m, and the first hint of gray light hit the high windows of the courtyard. William walked straight past the grand staircase, heading down the long gallery toward the older eastern wing of the estate. This section of the palace had been largely unoccupied since the early 2000s. A set of heavy oak doors blocked the entrance to the old private suites. The brass handles were tarnished, and a thin line of dust ran along the top of the doorframe, undisturbed for years. The prince inserted the silver key he discovered inside the hidden wall compartment. It turned smoothly with a heavy, metallic clunk. The door swung open to reveal a narrow corridor lined with covered furniture. White dust sheets draped over armchairs, mirrors, and stacked paintings gave the room an eerie, frozen appearance. This was the staging area where Diana's personal belongings were cataloged before the public auctions of 1997. The facts of that inventory were well documented in the official palace ledgers. The estate had preserved exactly 12 crates of personal correspondence, audio tapes, and legal files under a permanent court injunction. Publicly, the palace stated these items contained only family photographs and childhood memorabilia. The ledger on the table near the door confirmed this, listing the contents of crate number 4 as family scrapbooks from the 80s. William approached the 4th crate, which sat on a low wooden pallet in the corner of the room. He pulled off the protective plastic wrapping and sliced through the official crown security tape with a pocket knife. Inside, beneath a layer of actual photo albums, lay a secondary false bottom made of reinforced plywood. He lifted the wood panel to find a hidden cache of microfiche reels and a small portable reading device. The tension in the room spiked as William loaded the first reel into the viewer. The machine hummed to life, projecting a bright square of light onto the dusty wall. The first image was a scanned copy of a confidential medical assessment from 1993. It wasn't about Diana. The document detailed a private, independent psychological evaluation of the entire senior royal hierarchy, commissioned by an outside legal team during the separation. The existence of this evaluation was a massive institutional secret. If these assessments had leaked during the divorce, Parliament would have been legally obligated to review the stability of the succession line under the terms of the Regency Act. The files contained direct interviews with staff, medical professionals, and former friends, all detailing the intense internal pressures behind palace walls. William scrolled through the pages, his eyes tracking the official stamps at the bottom of each sheet. The documents proved that the palace apparatus had actively monitored the mental health of its members, not for medical care, but for strategic leverage in legal battles. His mother had managed to secure the master copies of these reports before they could be used against her in court. William reached the end of the first reel. A series of redacted paragraphs pointed to a specific financial transaction executed through a Swiss bank account in 1994. The name of the beneficiary was completely blacked out with heavy ink, but the authorizing signature belonged to a senior courtier who answered directly to the Prince of Wales's office at the time. William resolved this by cross-referencing the ledger numbers with the canvas folder he brought from the basement safe. The dates matched perfectly. The hidden transaction was a massive payout to an individual who had threatened to expose the internal medical reports to the British press. The palace had used private duchy funds to buy absolute silence, a move that violated multiple financial regulations. But the payout opened a far more dangerous question. Why had this specific reel been hidden in an unoccupied wing of Kensington Palace rather than destroyed along with the other divorce files? William found the answer attached to a small sticky note on the back of the microfiche container. The note was written by Diana's former private secretary, hinting that a second, identical set of reels had been sent abroad for safekeeping. The prince realized the institutional danger was not confined to the archive room. If a duplicate set of these files existed outside the UK, the royal family was entirely vulnerable to external blackmail. He immediately picked up his secure mobile phone and dialed the direct number for the head of MI5. He needed to know if any foreign intelligence service had flagged these specific documents over the past 3 decades. The call was brief and clinical. William gave the exact serial numbers stamped on the microfiche reels and demanded a full sweep of the registry logs. While he waited for a response, he began packing the microfiche device and the reels into his briefcase. He knew every minute he spent in the old wing increased the risk of a leak from the internal palace staff. Outside, the courtyard was beginning to wake up. The distant sound of a delivery truck gears shifting echoed through the stone archways. A senior housekeeper walked past the window of the long gallery, pausing slightly when she noticed the lights on in the abandoned suite. She didn't approach, but William saw her make a note on her digital tablet. The circle of secrecy was shrinking rapidly. The phone in William's pocket buzzed with a text message from his security team. A private helicopter had just spun up its rotors at the airfield near Highgrove. The king was not waiting for his afternoon appointment. Charles was flying directly to London to intercept his son before the documents could leave the palace grounds. The timeline had just collapsed from hours to minutes. William didn't panic. He closed the briefcase, locked the heavy oak doors of the suite, and walked calmly back toward his private quarters. He had the physical evidence, the legal backing, and the historical truth in his hands. As he reached the main courtyard, the deep thump of helicopter blades began to vibrate through the morning air, signaling his father's arrival at the palace helipad. The document that rewrites history. The helicopter wheels touched down on the damp grass of the palace paddock with a sharp, shuddering bounce. William stood by the window of his first-floor study, looking down at the red and white aircraft. The door flew open before the rotor blades had even fully stopped spinning. A personal protection officer stepped out first, scanning the perimeter, followed immediately by the king. Charles walked with an unusually rapid stride across the lawn, his overcoat flapping slightly in the wind. He didn't look up at the windows. He went straight into the ground floor side entrance, bypassing the main reception line entirely. Upstairs, William unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and took out the specific canvas folder from the hidden wall compartment. He placed it squarely in the middle of his mahogany writing desk. The facts surrounding this specific folder were rooted in a constitutional crisis from 1992. That was the year the palace drafted a highly confidential contingency paper, known internally as the Windsor Accord. Public history states the accord was merely an agreement regarding how royal finances would be handled after the fire at Windsor Castle. In reality, the document had an entirely separate secret annex that dealt directly with the rules of succession during a marital breakdown. William opened the folder to the final page, where 3 signatures were visible under the official crown seal. One belonged to the former Prime Minister, the second belonged to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The third signature was his mother's, but it was accompanied by a handwritten codicil that changed the entire legal weight of the agreement. The tension rose as William read the exact wording of that codicil. Diana had stipulated that if Charles ever remarried under civil law, a specific portion of the private duchy assets would automatically transfer into an independent trust. This trust was legally designated to fund an alternative administrative court for the Prince of Wales, completely separate from the main monarch's household. Essentially, it created a financial mechanism for a shadow monarchy. The existence of this clause explained why the palace spent decades trying to locate and destroy every copy of the annex. If the public or parliament discovered that a parallel royal budget existed, the entire justification for the sovereign grant would be legally challenged. The institution had survived for 30 years on the assumption that all private crown revenues were fully integrated and accounted for. A knock on the door interrupted the silence. William didn't move from his chair. He watched the brass handle turn as his father stepped into the study. Charles closed the door firmly behind him, his breathing slightly elevated from the hurried walk up the stairs. He didn't offer a traditional greeting. His eyes went straight to the canvas folder sitting on the desk. Charles asked directly where his son had found the folder. William picked up a small, faded photograph that had been tucked inside the canvas lining. The image showed a young William and Harry sitting on a bench at Highgrove in 1994. On the back of the frame, Diana had written a sequence of numbers that corresponded exactly to the old ledger codes in the Kensington archive. The mystery of how the document survived the post-1997 purge was instantly resolved. The palace lawyers had searched every official administrative safe in London and Gloucestershire after the funeral. They had audited every digital registry and bank vault, but they had never searched the ordinary childhood photo frames left in the private family sitting rooms. Diana had hidden the ultimate legal lever in plain sight, protected by the sentimentality of her children's bedrooms. But the hiding place brought forward a far more immediate crisis. William turned the folder toward his father, pointing directly to a subclause dated 1996. This clause stated that if the reigning monarch failed to maintain certain specific terms of the family settlement, the trustees of the independent fund had the legal authority to trigger an immediate parliamentary review of the royal estate. The prince looked at his father and stated clearly that the terms had already been violated. The palace had quietly absorbed 2 of the overseas properties mentioned in the accord into the general sovereign pool during the consolidation project of 2022. It was done without the required written consent of the designated beneficiaries, which meant the current administration was technically in breach of a binding historical contract. Charles took a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and leaned over the desk. He studied the ink signature, checking the distinct loop of the letters against his own memory of the negotiations. The room was completely quiet except for the distant, low hum of London traffic outside the palace gates. The king realized that his own legal team had inadvertently created a massive constitutional vulnerability when they altered the property portfolios. The phone on the corner of the desk began to chime. It was a secure call from the Privy Council office. William reached out and pressed the mute button, refusing to break the focus of the meeting. He needed a direct verbal commitment from his father before any official advisors were brought into the room to handle the paperwork. Charles sat down in the armchair opposite the desk, looking visibly aged under the sharp morning light. The authority of the crown, which he had waited decades to inherit, was suddenly being checked by a decades-old document hidden in a picture frame. He didn't argue or deny the validity of the text. He knew the legal framework was completely airtight. The next step would determine the entire future of the household management. If William chose to submit the annex to the current parliamentary committee, the legal oversight of the royal family's private wealth would shift entirely out of palace hands. The balance of power inside the building had shifted permanently within the span of a single morning, leaving the king to figure out exactly how to negotiate with his own heir. Highgrove on high alert. A light rain began to fall over the stone terrace of Highgrove House, streaking the glass windows of the garden room. Down the hallway, a red light blinked rapidly on the secure communications console inside the protection team's office. It was exactly 10 in the morning. The king's personal secretary, Sir Edward Young, stood by the mahogany desk, holding an encrypted data tablet that was receiving a massive file dump from London. The physical staff at the estate had been placed on immediate standby notice just 60 minutes earlier. The facts of the estate's protocol were rigid and required total operational silence during an internal security event. No private mobile devices were permitted within the main building, and the external gate guards had already turned away 2 scheduled delivery trucks at the main entrance on Bath Road. Edward looked down at the tablet screen, where a system log detailed a breach of the Central Royal Archive Index. The data stream originated directly from the secure network terminal at Kensington Palace. Someone was downloading old administrative files that had been restricted under the Public Records Act since 1999. The digital certificates used to access the server belonged to the Prince of Wales's personal office. The tension in the staff room grew as a second alert appeared on the screen. The system showed that an entire section of the private correspondence registry from 1991 had just been unsealed. These specific files contained the confidential memos between the Prince's trust lawyers and the Treasury Department. The documents had been flagged as permanently closed to public scrutiny to protect the internal financial arrangements of the duchy. Edward called the resident security coordinator into the room and ordered an immediate diagnostic sweep of the local network. He needed to verify if any duplicate copies of these specific files were stored on the Highgrove backup servers. The institution operated a decentralized digital network, meaning a security breach in London could automatically trigger a defensive lockout of the files in Gloucestershire. The archivist on duty confirmed that the local server had just entered an automated protection mode. The files relating to the 1991 financial restructuring were completely frozen, inaccessible even to the king's private staff. This meant the master system in London had taken unilateral control of the entire archive network, shutting out the countryside estate entirely. A mystery emerged when the security sweep flagged a ghost connection on the line. An unauthorized device had accessed the Highgrove terminal just 20 minutes before the London vault was opened. The IP address traced back to a small cottage on the perimeter of the estate grounds, a property currently occupied by a retired land agent named Arthur Pendleton, who had managed the duchy accounts in the 90s. Edward resolved this by sending 2 protection officers directly to the cottage. They discovered that Arthur had not been hacking the system. He had been instructed by a senior palace official to upload an old decryption key into the network. The retired agent had kept an analog logbook of the old system codes in his desk drawer for 30 years, and he had simply followed a direct voice command from a trusted voice in the household. But the network connection opened a far more dangerous question for the staff at Highgrove. The voice command that Arthur followed did not come from William's team. The phone log showed the call originated from a private office inside Clarence House, the king's secondary London residence. Someone within Charles's own inner circle had intentionally enabled the system bypass, allowing the files to be pulled without the king's explicit knowledge. The realization that an insider had facilitated the data transfer caused an immediate shift in strategy. Edward knew that if a senior staff member was working with the prince's office, the entire communication strategy of the king's household was compromised. He ordered a complete freeze on all outgoing emails and digital memos from Highgrove until the source of the call could be verified. Outside in the courtyard, the rain was coming down harder, pooling on the gravel driveway. The estate's land management team was instructed to clear the main lawn for an unscheduled arrival, but the helicopter pad remained empty. The weather conditions over the south of England were deteriorating rapidly, making a return flight from London highly unlikely within the next few hours. The phone on Edward's desk rang with an unlisted number. It was the private secretary to the Home Secretary, asking for an immediate clarification on the legal status of the Duchy of Cornwall archives. Word of the archive breach had already reached the upper levels of the civil service, raising concerns about a potential conflict with the current transparency laws before Parliament. Edward provided a neutral, standardized response, stating that the family was conducting a routine internal audit of historical records. He hung up the phone quickly, knowing the explanation was completely inadequate. The civil service would not accept a vague statement if the legal boundaries of the estate's wealth were being rewritten by a decades-old document. He walked into the main drawing room, where a large oil portrait of Diana hung above the fireplace. The room was cold, the heating having been lowered to protect the old fabrics and woodwork. He looked at the heavy bureau in the corner, where the king kept his private diaries from his time as the Prince of Wales. Those volumes contained the personal reflections that corresponded to the financial records William now held. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 11, its deep chime echoing through the empty rooms of the house. The entire estate felt suspended, waiting for the outcome of the meeting taking place inside the study at Kensington Palace. The staff moved quietly through the corridors, avoiding any unnecessary conversation, fully aware that the administrative structure they served was facing an unprecedented internal challenge. Edward returned to the communication room to find a fresh update on the data tablet. The terminal in London had completed its download, and the system log showed that the user had logged off the network entirely. The files were now completely offline, contained within a physical device that could not be tracked or deleted remotely by the palace technicians. The leverage had shifted completely away from the countryside estate. The staff at Highgrove could do nothing more but monitor the secure lines and wait for a direct command from the king. The silence from London was the most concerning aspect of the situation, indicating that the conversation between father and son had moved far beyond a standard administrative dispute into an entirely unresolved constitutional reality. The confrontation behind closed doors. The mahogany door of the first-floor study clicked shut, cutting off the distant murmur of the palace staff. Prince William remained seated behind his writing desk, his hands resting flat on the smooth wood surface. Across from him, King Charles stood for a long moment by the heavy velvet window curtains, looking down at the empty courtyard before turning to face his son. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the steady tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. William broke the silence by sliding the canvas folder across the desk, stopping it exactly an inch from the edge. The facts of the document were now undeniable. The paper was the original, unredacted annex to the Windsor Accord, a document the king believed had been shredded and buried in the institutional graveyard of the late 90s. The tension in the room spiked as Charles walked slowly to the desk but refused to sit down. He looked at the distinctive slanted handwriting of Princess Diana looping across the bottom of the open page. The text clearly outlined a secret legal trigger that would automatically divert massive blocks of private duchy assets into an independent trust if the crown ever attempted to alter the specific inheritance path of the family estates. William stated clearly that the palace had violated those terms during the recent consolidation project of 2022. The institution had quietly merged two major overseas holdings into the General Sovereign Fund without the required written consent of the designated heirs. By doing so, the current administration had technically triggered the legal mechanism Diana had hidden decades ago, effectively invalidating the standard financial boundaries of the monarchy. Charles adjusted his reading glasses, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the page to look at the supporting financial receipts from 1995. The documents showed a series of massive, undocumented bank transfers authorized by his own former legal team to buy the silence of an outside individual who possessed internal medical files. The proof was clear, physical, and legally binding under current British financial statutes. How these documents remained completely undetected by the palace legal team for 30 years hung in the air. Charles asked directly who else had seen these specific files since they were removed from the Kensington basement vault. He knew that if the details had already been leaked to the press or shared with parliamentary oversight committees, the institutional damage would be completely beyond repair. William resolved this by opening his laptop and showing a secure local system log. He had not shared the files with the media or the government. Instead, he had routed the documents through a private, encrypted server belonging exclusively to the Duchy of Cornwall legal team. The files were safe from external leaks, but they were now fully under William's unilateral control, entirely out of the reach of Buckingham Palace's administrative staff. But the leak risk immediately opened a far more difficult question regarding the future governance of the household. William looked directly at his father and delivered an absolute ultimatum. He did not demand financial compensation or a public apology. He demanded an immediate, total restructuring of the royal estate's management board, giving his own office veto power over any future property consolidations or asset transfers. The king sank into the armchair opposite the desk, the historical weight of his past choices catching up to him in the sharp morning light. If he refused the ultimatum, William possessed the exact legal leverage needed to trigger an independent parliamentary review of the crown's private wealth. Such a review would expose decades of secret financial maneuvers to the public, destroying the carefully managed reputation of the modern monarchy within a matter of days. Charles asked for a delay, suggesting that the matter be handled through a formal committee consisting of the family's senior legal advisors. William rejected the proposal instantly, stating that the time for committee meetings had passed when the palace chose to alter the property portfolios in 2022 without consulting him. The boundary had been crossed, and the balance of power inside the building had shifted permanently. The phone on the desk chimed again, with a secure alert from the Privy Council office, but neither man looked at the screen. The reality of the situation was entirely personal, a direct confrontation between a father trying to protect the traditional authority of the throne and a son executing a precise legal strategy designed by his late mother to protect the future of her children. Charles took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking visibly exhausted. He realized that Diana's final command, hidden for nearly 3 decades inside a simple childhood photograph frame, had successfully created an airtight check on his own institutional power. The legal framework she built was flawless, surviving every audit and purge because it relied on the one thing the palace lawyers never thought to look for: a mother's foresight. The king finally nodded his head in a slow, reluctant gesture of agreement. He stated that his office would draft the necessary administrative changes to give the Prince of Wales full oversight of the asset boards by the end of the week. The confrontation was over, resolved not through shouting or dramatic declarations, but through the quiet presentation of undeniable facts and historical truths that left the crown with absolutely no room to maneuver. William closed the canvas folder, locking it back inside his briefcase with a quick digital code. He stood up, signaling that the meeting was concluded. As Charles walked back toward the side entrance where his helicopter was waiting, both men knew that the internal dynamics of the House of Windsor had been fundamentally rewritten, leaving the future of the monarchy entirely in the hands of the heir. The secrets pulled from the Kensington Palace vault have permanently rewritten the power dynamics within the House of Windsor. This high-stakes legal confrontation proves that Princess Diana's foresight continues to protect her children's future from beyond the grave.